Hello everyone. It's September, and the fall is upon us, which means that school is back in session, the days are getting shorter, the nights are getting longer, and the fascination with the supernatural is in the air. Because it's that time of the year, we at the Stoneham Public Library are starting up another season of Haunting the Fireside for the fall and winter. Join us as we kick off the scares of this episode with some school-related ghost stories. Welcome back to Haunting the Fireside, a program about ghosts and other mystical things. The tales I share are those that set the perfect mood for dark, cold, and stormy nights in the fall and winter. So, grab some headphones, take a seat, and get settled as we listen to some stories from a librarian's college days, stories that give a new meaning to the phrase, school spirit. Years ago, I had gone to a small private college in New Hampshire. The school was founded in the 1800s, so it is unsurprising that there were plenty of ghost stories to go around. One hears it all from older students and faculty members, some of whom claim to have had their own experiences with the paranormal. Even now, I can still remember some of the history and legends surrounding the college. One of my professors, who appeared to be on the skeptical side of things, told my class about ghost tours that the school used to host on Halloween night. Groups would flock to the paranormal hotspots on campus, where they would conduct EVP sessions and seances, with the hopes of communicating with the dead. From other sources, I heard that a group of students once brought a Ouija board up to the third floor of the main administrative building, the most haunted place on campus. As the story goes, they sat somewhere outside the school's radio station, which is at the end of the hallway, and proceeded to contact the spirit world. Legend has it that they spoke with an evil entity that haunts that part of the building. Also, the story of a girl who supposedly committed suicide was sometimes connected to a window that had been walled up with bricks on the second floor of this building. In my student days, I would often stroll around campus, usually alone and at night, in search of what can be thought of as evidence for ghosts. I went to as many of these areas as I was able, but would come back with nothing to write home about. If we were to define evidence for the paranormal, it seems that we all wish to see something in order to believe it, rather than settle on any of the other senses. Even if we hear a noise, or feel something brush against us, but never see the source of the sound or sensation, many of us try to chalk it up to a natural cause, and leave it at that. That is why I remain unconvinced, despite one strange occasion in my second year at college. One night, I walked over to the most haunted building on campus, around 8:30 or 9 o'clock. My intention was to go up to the most haunted floor, the third floor, and do some assigned reading for one of my classes, all while giving me an excuse to situate myself in a haunted building, hopefully long enough to encounter something. I sat at a desk that was located across from the radio station, near where the students allegedly played with the Ouija board, and pulled out my book and notebook. In front of me was a hallway that contained professors' offices, and to my right was a stairwell that led up to a hangout for honors students. It was a dim little nook just off the main hallway, lit only by a soft ray of recessed lighting in the ceiling above the desk. I can't recall exactly how long I had been there, but all of a sudden, I heard a single loud thud or bang that almost made me jump out of the chair. It sounded as if a heavy object had crashed to the floor. I looked up and stared straight ahead in the direction of the door that led to the offices, for this is the direction from which I heard the noise. Although the door was closed, it had a glass window, so I was able to gaze through it, though there wasn't much to see because the hallway lights were off. I watched and waited for several moments, but no other sounds followed, and no one had emerged from the door. However, I noticed that a red light was emanating from something in the office across the hall. Of course, the lights in that office were off as well, and due to the late hour, I couldn't see what it really was. Just a red bead fixed in the air against a backdrop of lightless black. I figured that it must have been some kind of electronic device, and returned to reading my book. But the longer I sat there, the more I became uneasy, feeling or thinking that I was being watched, or that something wanted me to leave. The air became increasingly warm, and my agitation grew to the extent that I believed I was in danger. Since I could no longer concentrate on my work, I got up, packed my bag, and stepped back out into the main hallway. Before I headed downstairs and out of the building, I stopped, stood quietly, and stared back up the hallway. I stayed that way for some time, scanning the area for anything out of the ordinary. An orb, a dark figure, a wisp of smoke, or however else a spirit can manifest itself. But I saw nothing. I wondered if it was just the power of suggestion, my imagination getting the better of me, or if it really was something paranormal. In the end, my curiosity was checked by something for which I had no satisfactory explanation, either natural or supernatural. Like I said, I didn't experience anything overtly paranormal during my 4 years of college. However, a friend of mine, whom I'll call Mike, was convinced that several experiences, which he shared with me in our 4th year, were paranormal in nature. At the time, I was living in an apartment-style dormitory on campus with Mike and 3 other friends. According to my journal, it was in the fall semester of senior year, November of 2018 to be exact, that Mike and Stephanie, one of our roommates, had told me about the strange things that they had observed on numerous occasions. The 3 of us were sitting at the kitchen table, hanging out, when the subject of ghosts had come up. I must have expressed my lifelong fascination with the supernatural, because Mike and Stephanie grinned knowingly to one another, then turned to me and said, with utter seriousness, that our unit was haunted. They claimed that they would often see shadows moving about the apartment when they knew that they were alone. Now, Mike studied and did homework at one end of the kitchen table, as it had enough space for his laptop and was more convenient than walking all the way across campus to the library. I remember this because I saw him sitting there most days after lunch or after classes, when I came back to the apartment to gather my things and go to the library, where I spent most of my time. According to his testimony, there were times when he would be reading or writing when, unexpectedly, he would see, out of the corner of his eye, a dark shape moving towards him. From what he could tell, it always seemed to be crossing the room from his right-hand side. Because he wore headphones, he would be startled by the sudden movement. When he turned to face the shadow directly, it would vanish. They were apparently so real to him that, after these occurrences, he would knock on our bedroom doors or text us to see if we were around. But the four of us were never at the dorm during these times. Stephanie would always get up very early in the morning, around 5 or 6 o'clock. Since that was a far cry from when the rest of us would awaken, she would sit at the kitchen table, eating breakfast, drinking coffee, and brewing more coffee for later in the day. In these moments of early morning solitude, she too would see shadows moving about the apartment. Somehow, she was able to see them more distinctly, and described them as humanoid, similar to what are called shadow people. According to her, she saw them start from the door that led into our unit and glide down the hallway that led to our rooms, where they passed out of view. She then strongly suggested that we take down a tapestry that hung on the wall because it bore a pentagram. After all, such things are typically associated with the occult and tend to open metaphysical doors. For the record, the tapestry belonged to another roommate, who neither dabbled in nor practiced those things. It was in all likelihood quite ignorant of or indifferent to what it symbolized. I was intrigued upon hearing that we had a possible haunting on our hands. At the same time, I found it hard to believe that I was actually living in a haunted place. I then began to ask Mike and Stephanie specific questions about their experiences, questions that would point towards logical causes instead of supernatural ones. The shadows could have been caused by one of the lights meeting with other objects in the room. A floating piece of dust, a flying insect, or a hand waving in the air when someone was stretching. Or perhaps it was some kind of optical illusion caused by a combination of spotty lighting and the line of sight that Mike and Stephanie had from their respective positions. Out of curiosity, I decided to investigate our apartment the next time I knew I would have the place to myself. When that time came, I took turns sitting where Mike and Stephanie sat when they saw the shadows. At one point, I sat on the couch and looked over the room in silence, trying to detect any shadow that moved independently of a natural cause. Alas, I saw nothing like what my friends had described. Once I had spent enough time with my ghost hunt, I recorded my thoughts on the matter with, I admit, some disappointment that I didn't get to catch a glimpse of these shadow people. Maybe it was just a trick of the light? Days, weeks, or months later, Mike spoke to me about more instances of ghostly activity from previous years. During our third year, we had rooms on the third floor in one of the older dormitories on campus. The building was rather small compared to other dorms. It was so old that the laminate wood flooring in most of the rooms were worn and scratched, and there wasn't even an elevator. Mike and his roommate were at one end of the hallway, while my roommate and I were at the other. Because of this, there was practically no foot traffic going past our rooms. Also, seeing how it was the top floor, no one was above us, which made it one of the quietest areas in the building, second only to the basement. That was an ideal living situation, as far as the noise level went. Now that I think of it, the whole building was usually quiet, so much so that you would sometimes think you were the only person there. While I prefer that kind of setting, there were times, especially on the weekends, when the dorm exuded a silent as the grave atmosphere, like the early scenes of The Shining. Most people either went home for the weekend, like my roommate, or went out to parties and the like. An old building, mixed with a small resident population, is bound to create obstacles for the anxious mind and the overactive imagination. Mike told me that whenever he traveled in the hallway at night, a feeling of unease would come over him, as if he was being watched. This sentiment was especially strong when he would walk a few doors down to use the restroom, after which he had to shut off the light from inside before opening the door. For a moment, he would be thrown into pitch darkness. In the time it took for him to turn off the light and open the bathroom door, he would get the sense that someone, or something, was standing in the room, watching him leave. In response, he would swiftly exit the bathroom and walk briskly back to his room, fighting the temptation to look over his shoulder. He was afraid of what he might see if he did. The hallway and the restroom were not the only places that gave Mike the creeps. Regardless of the time of day or night, Mike loathed having to do laundry in that dorm. The washing machine and the dryer were located in the basement, which was at the bottom of a particularly steep and narrow flight of stairs. It was not so much as going down that bothered him, but rather, it was coming up that fueled his consternation. Whenever he ascended the steps from the basement, he felt as if there was a dark presence at the bottom of the stairs, staring up at him. Unlike his experience upstairs, he sometimes turned around to see whether anyone was actually there. There never was. Truth be told, I experienced a similar feeling whenever I had to climb those stairs. Of course, it is entirely possible, maybe even likely, that our minds have been playing tricks on us. I have sometimes wondered if it was some kind of instinct, seemingly a common one, which causes us to become apprehensive whenever we turn our back to a dark or open space. Still, that doesn't necessarily discount the existence of a visible or invisible threat. There is one more incident that Mike told me about. I think it is the most interesting one, which is why I saved it for last. In our first year, he and I lived in a comfortable 5-room unit with 7 other classmates in one of the newer dorms on campus. 3 of the rooms had 2 beds, one had 3, and another had 1. However, the single room, for some reason, went unoccupied for the longest time. I don't know if it was empty at the time this account takes place, nor do I know if it had anything to do with my friend's experience. I just recall one day, when months of curiosity had come to a head, Someone had opened the door to that room, probably by picking the lock. Within minutes, the landline telephone, which sat on the desk next to the bed, started to ring. It struck us all as bizarre, because that was the first and only time that such a thing had happened. I cannot remember if anyone dared to answer it, or if they did, who was on the other end of the line. In any event, a student arrived to take the room at some point during the spring semester, and while she kept mostly to herself, she never complained of the room being haunted, or anything like that. Anyway, we were a close-knit group, at least for the first semester. The 9 of us would often have dinner together in the dining hall, take walks around campus, things like that. Now, 2 girls in our circle, Kara and Kelly, were known to pull harmless pranks from time to time. Kara was behind most of them. Kelly sometimes played the unwilling accomplice, but other times, she informed us about Kara's shenanigans. I was also given to similar mischief myself, though I mostly targeted my roommate by sneaking up behind him, or jumping out at him from around a corner. But someone had pulled a prank on Mike, if it truly was a prank at all, which spooked him quite a bit. As it turns out, however, none of us had anything to do with it. One night, Mike awoke to a soft tapping on his bedroom door. The sound was not a full-on knocking, nor was it produced rapidly, as if there was an emergency. It was slow, cautious, periodical. He opened his eyes and rolled over. The alarm clock on his nightstand read 3:15 a.m. Initially, he thought his roommate had gotten up to use the restroom and simply forgot his key to unlock the door, which locked automatically when it was closed. Once his eyes were adjusted to the darkness, Mike looked across the room to confirm that his roommate was in bed, clearly fast asleep. Meanwhile, the light knocks continued. Begrudgingly, Mike got up, annoyed that he had been dragged through the veil of a deep sleep. He was hesitant about opening the door, as he expected to get jump-scared, or worse, by whoever was on the other side. Like most interior doors, the bottom was raised off the floor just enough to allow a sliver of the hall light to creep into the room. Taking advantage of this, he got down and peered under the door to see if he could identify this visitor by their feet. The thing is, he saw no feet. Either this person was standing firmly against the wall, just outside of Mike's vision, or they were hovering over the floor, like a phantom. Puzzled, he considered his options. Either allow this person to keep knocking until he or she got bored and moved on, or confront the person. Mike was potentially intimidating, as he had a large frame, tattoos, and a black beard. After some deliberation, he turned the knob and flung the door open, expecting to see someone. Instead, he was face to face with a well-lit, but otherwise empty hallway. Unnerved, he set out to patrol the unit, including the 2 bathrooms and the small storage closet that was just across the hall from his room. He made his first round through, fully anticipating for someone to be hiding around a corner or behind a shower curtain. It did not take him long to survey the close-quartered unit. He then surveyed the corridor just outside the entrance to our suite, and even peeked into the unit next door. Finally, he backtracked to see if he could catch the prankster off guard, if he or she was still around. When his searches proved fruitless, he retired to his room. As you can imagine, he did not sleep well for the rest of the night. Over the next few days, he approached our other roommates, starting with the two girls who lived in the next room over. To his astonishment, everyone denied having knocked on his door that night. After he got done telling me all this, he and I walked through the range of questions that this whole ordeal had raised. When he opened the door, did he hear the scampering of feet on the carpeted hallway? What about the closing of a door or the click of a doorknob? These sounds would have been easy to pick up so early in the morning, or so late at night, when noise pollution is largely absent. He said that he listened for all that during his inspection. He heard nothing. So then, who was knocking on Mike's door at nearly 3:30 in the morning? Whoever it was must have been someone who lived outside our unit. But why his door, and no one else's? As you can see from the illustration, it would be very easy for someone to enter the unit from the main corridor, as the fire door was always kept open for safety purposes. Such a person could march straight up the hallway to Mike's room, knock on the door, and rush out before either Mike or his roommate were able to open it. But it would have been much easier to do this with the room directly to the right of the entrance. So then, was it someone he knew? If it was a friend of his, no one ever confessed it to him, since he was telling me about it 3 years later. Was it some random student who had had too many drinks at a party nearby and wandered into the wrong unit? If that was the case, he or she must have been the quietest drunk college student in history. In other words, not likely. By the end of our conversation, neither of us could come up with a suitable explanation for what he had experienced. To this day, I still try to imagine what it must have been like to answer the incessant knocking on the door, to be met with an empty hallway, to roam a silent hallway in the dead of night, looking for anyone, but seeing no one, and ultimately finding oneself entirely alone at such a terrible hour, the witching hour, as some call it. Years later, this incident remains a mystery. That's the end of another episode of the Book Service Podcast, brought to you by the Stoneham Public Library. We hope you enjoy the show, and as always, thanks for listening, and keep on reading.